What is going on, my fellow Martians? Welcome to another episode of Mixed Martial Arts. My name is Austin Shaper, and this is a daily show where we explore the topics of UAP, UFC, and World War III. Today is going to be a World War III geopolitical episode. Before we dive into today's topic, go ahead and click subscribe on the video. That helps my channel out a lot. I really appreciate it. And if you guys want to get more of this content, we do post videos every single friggin' day, for the most part, on these three subject areas. So, diving into today's episode, I wanted to cover the potential conflict that is brewing in the Pacific with Taiwan and China. I'm sure you guys have kept up with this partially in the news if you found this video. There's a lot going on, a lot developing. It seems like in this day and age, with the fog of war being so thick in the Russia-Ukraine war and it being so hard to deduce what on earth is actually going on over there, who's actually winning? Is it a stalemate? Is Russia winning? You know, there was I don't know what you would call it, not a poll, but there was a report that came out from, I don't exactly know what the source was. I think it was maybe like the New York Times or Washington Post, one of those two perhaps, where they were discussing the casualty numbers in the conflict, and it was something like 70,000 dead in Ukraine, or on the Ukrainian side, and I think like 120,000 dead on the Russian side, and then, many hundred thousands more injuries. So a lot of people were responding to that and saying it was all bullshit. The numbers were deflated for Ukraine or inflated for Russia or both. And we just don't know the truth of it. I find it very hard to believe that Ukraine has lost under 100,000 people, but I suppose that's neither here nor there. I bring up the point to reiterate the fact that it's very hard to figure out what's really going on in the world right now. There's so much disinformation going on from all the parties involved in these potential conflicts, and this China-Taiwan situation that is brewing in the South China Sea is another one of those situations where we just don't know for 100% certainty all the factors that are at play here. We only know from the civilian's perspective as to what's really going on and how likely or unlikely this conflict really is. I want to start off, by reading an article that I thought was rather telling, and you guys probably heard, I think last year this was really being discussed, and the Xi Jinping had come out supposedly and told his nation to be ready for a war in the Taiwan Strait by, I think he said like 2030. I believe it was 2030 or maybe even 2027, but quite a few years off. And a lot of people kind of took that as a sigh of relief. And, perhaps we don't have to worry about this conflict happening anytime soon. I think that is a rather extremely optimistic take. I think that we're learning a lot of lessons from the Russia-Ukraine war. And one of those lessons is that sometimes the threat of economic sanctions, the threat of economic reprisal is not enough to dissuade I guess you want to call it dictator, a leader of a nation and a military. It's not enough to dissuade them from not invading a country if they already want to be separate from NATO and they want to be separate from the economic system of the United States. We clearly know that China and Russia both want that. They are actively making steps to separate themselves from economic dependency on the United States and on the West at large. And so let's dive into this article real quick. This comes from CNBC.com. It was on August 9th, titled "China Hawk Says Beijing Could Attack Taiwan by 2024, Bringing War to the West." I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just give you guys a few bullet points. It says, prominent China hawk Kyle Bass told CNBC on Tuesday that he believes Chinese President Xi Jinping is determined to bring war to the West with an invasion of Taiwan likely before the end of 2024. Bass, I don't know how you pronounce it, who is founder and chief investment officer at United States Investment from Heyman Capital Management, said that the West, and particularly Wall Street, is too preoccupied by the apparent economic unviability of such an attack, aka a lot of people just believe that because of the economic dependence of both the West on China and China on the West, that a actual kinetic conflict brewing between the two of them and then actually breaking out into reality is rather unlikely. We hear this argument time and time again, but just take note how Russia was not dissuaded by that. And, again, fog of war, we don't know the truth of this. We hear some people saying their economy is on the verge of collapse. We've been hearing that since the war started. And then, we're also seeing people on the opposite side say that their economy is booming and that we've essentially pushed more money into their market through this conflict. I am not only am I not a military expert, but I'm especially not an economic expert. So maybe you guys have a take on that. I do not. But moving on, he says, much like Russia President Vladimir Putin, whose war in Ukraine has isolated his country from the West, Xi is not solely concerned with the potential economic fallout. If you listen to what Xi says, I believe he will end up acquiring/reacquiring Taiwan by force by the end of next year. And it goes on to just kind of give the different reasons, the timing, especially with the election. I think that's one that really maybe is going under the radar. The potential, especially with this election, have Trump potentially being indicted and, Biden running for office again. We don't know what's going to happen, but when there's such a divisive societal and political dispute going on, it opens up the door for other countries to make a move. Perhaps they feel that Biden would not intervene, and it's a bluff saying that they would intervene if they tried to take Taiwan by force. The United States would help. Would they not help? We have this policy of strategic ambiguity, and don't know if that's how you pronounce the word, but you guys take my point. We're not 100% clear cut. It's not black and white on if we would intervene, and if we were going to, at what degree. I think it's alarming because there's just so much going on right now all over the world, and I think that Xi Jinping, I think in his perspective, the timing really couldn't be better for a potential invasion in 2024. Let's just add up right off the bat the I don't want to say foolishness because I can understand the moral implications. We want to defend people all over the world. I think it's a righteous cause to defend people who are going to be subjugated by a bigger power. Taiwan broke away and created their own independence after World War II from China, and then now it's been in dispute for decades and decades, and we know that China is getting rather desperate to take it back. We also have heard that they prefer to go a peaceful resolution, kind of what they're doing with Hong Kong through subversion and other means other than a kinetic war. But the problem with it, there's many problems with it. Let's just start off the fact that the American homeland, the United States mainland, is over 7,000 miles away from Taiwan. Now, Taiwan from China is 100 miles or slightly less than 100 miles from the shores of China. That's a giant problem. You guys are already seeing the fallout in the Ukraine-Russia war, both from the perspective of how fast equipment is getting to the Ukrainians and the fact that the quality of the equipment is already being degraded. I mean, the F-16s were promised, and then now they've been pushed back until, I think, next year. And on top of that, you have, we approved the cluster munitions, and they, American government openly came out and said the reason why we're using these controversial weapons is because we're running low on, artillery shells, artillery rounds. And so they basically don't have a choice. So they're kind of admitting there what's unspoken in that statement that was released is that they just don't have the capability to support Ukraine to the level that would potentially turn the conflict in Ukrainians' favor. And, the more prolonged the conflict goes, all likelihood is the support from both the American public is going to rapidly wane as we have domestic problems here. I mean, we just had this giant fire in Hawaii. Biden's giving, $700 per household. Meanwhile, we're giving, over $100 billion to Ukraine. These things happening simultaneously is going to create a lot of issues on the domestic front. And so the likelihood of us being able to up the quality and the speed of the equipment to Ukraine it's not great. It's getting worse, probably not better. And now if you look at a potential conflict with China and Taiwan, how on earth, let's put the morality aside of it, do you believe it's a morally righteous thing for the United States to intervene, or do you believe that they're just being the police of the world? Why are we running these navigation drills all the way in the Pacific, thousands and thousands of miles away from our home? it's a mixed bag. China, we're not the only party that does that. China does it too. Russia does it too. They all do it, but I don't think there's a moral high horse to sit on in this conflict because kind of similar to what I've mentioned in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, if it does turn into World War III, well, then what was the right move here? Because if you were trying to prevent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dying through your direct intervention with NATO, with the United States into a conflict in Europe, and then it sparks into World War III, well, now you took it from potentially hundreds of thousands of people dying to now even hundreds of millions of people. And that's not an understatement, guys. We've never seen nuclear powers go at it before, even in a limited capacity. We've never seen it happen. The closest it ever came to happening was, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War, and thank God it never spilled over into a kinetic, direct conflict. If we don't get so lucky the next time around, well, then you'd have to look back in hindsight and say, was it worth intervening in Ukraine, and vice versa? If this Taiwan conflict continues down the path it's on, is it worth intervening at the cost of potentially starting a global conflict? And we obviously know Russia and Ukraine would team up on that. That probably includes Iran. That probably includes North Korea and a plethora of other nations. So there's an issue here with not just the moral aspect of it. Are we in a point where we morally have the right to go and police other parts of the world? I do not like the idea of anybody being subjugated, any nation, any peoples being subjugated, especially by a larger power. I think it's evil. I think it's wrong. If Taiwan wants to be independent, they deserve to be independent. The issue is, who's going to back up that claim? The only one who can back up that claim, Taiwan can't fight them off alone. We know that. It's a similar situation to Ukraine attempting to fight off Russia alone. It's just not really in the cards, and they have the unlucky reality of living very close to one of the world's biggest and most dangerous superpowers on the face of the planet in the history of time. So unluckily for them, they need big partners such as NATO, such as the United States, and we're thousands and thousands of miles. So if we're already away, so if we're already having issues supporting the Ukrainian conflict, even just financially, how could we possibly be able to provide a two-front simultaneously war? Let's just say it doesn't go direct right off the bat with the United States and China should this invasion of Taiwan happen. And we're just funding and supporting through equipment, personnel, whatever it is, through a giant budget, both the Ukrainian war and the Taiwan Strait War. I don't think that's even feasible. I mean, you see the distrust in the American public right now. You see the irritation and the frustration with, again, the Hawaii incident, the level of support that they're getting, that tax-paying American citizens are getting, and then now you see how it's going in Ukraine. What's it going to look like when you double that times two, and then you're trying to support a nation that is 90 to 100 miles away from China, while our mainland is 7,000 miles. Granted, we have bases in Guam and all over the Pacific, but at large, it's going to be very difficult to support them militarily. And if you do try to get involved with force, not just economic support or military arms support, but you tried to bring in personnel, you tried to bring the aircraft carriers over. We know that China has insane hypersonic technology. They have these aircraft, I forgot what they're called, aircraft killer missiles, carrier killers, and one missile essentially can take out the most powerful, naval vessels in the world. At this point in time, we do drastically outnumber, I believe, our number of aircraft carriers versus China. But as time goes by, we know that China is boosting their naval capabilities, and they have a bigger navy than the United States does currently, not aircraft carriers included, but the Navy as a whole is what we've read. So my point being is, not only is it morally questionable because of what the repercussions of the involvement could be, but I don't know if it's even feasible, and that's without direct conflict between China. If you add in the concept of direct conflict with China, which would then spiral into, China and Russia and all these other nations, Iran, North Korea, all going at it against NATO, United States, Europe, et cetera, not only the moral implications of that, of hundreds of thousands of dying compared to hundreds of millions of people dying, but what is the feasibility of it? Is it even possible? Do you guys believe that this conflict is happening sooner than later? I kind of do believe it. I've gone back and forth about this, and for a while I thought, okay, China's just posturing. They're not going to actually make a move. But then again, rewind it to before the Ukraine-Russia war happened, the spring before the war happened. Russia lined up, I think, over 300,000 troops, a bunch of tanks, vehicles, et cetera, on the border of Ukraine, and did essentially a training. A lot of people thought it was a bluff. It was never going to happen. And boom, less than a year later, it did turn kinetic. And I got to give credit to the Biden administration. I'm not a supporter of them. But the one thing I've seen in their administration that they did get right is when they predict that invasion would happen. With Russia invading Ukraine. They did predict it about 3 weeks in advance, I think, maybe even a month. And I myself and a lot of other people just kind of didn't buy it. We're like, if the Biden administration is saying it, it's probably bullshit. It did end up happening, and I don't know if you want to consider that as Putin taking the bait. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways to look at that, but at the end of the day, they were correct about that. And as far as this conflict brewing with Taiwan and China, I just think we're playing a very, very dangerous game. I think that there's going to be no winners. Similar to the Ukraine-Russia war, there's going to be no winners. There's just not. And right now, we're seeing the war of attrition with Ukraine and Russia. Right? They've been at war for over a year now, and there's no clear winner. It's much. I guess you could really consider it a war of attrition and a bit of a stalemate. It goes back and forth. Some weeks we hear that the offensive was doing good. Sometimes we hear that it fell. It fell right on its face, and then you hear Russia's making gains. You also hear that Ukraine hasn't even reached Russia's first of 3 defensive lines. So if something similar to that happens in Taiwan, I could see it being a prolonged conflict, and I can see the United States struggling to support Taiwan just from the from our capability perspective. And I also can see us backing out and saying, we don't have a dog in this fight. We have no ability. I understand the implications of China taking Taiwan, the semiconductor chips, their placement in the Pacific. It's a dangerous game we're playing here, but I think that at the end of the day, that's what's so scary and why I so fascinated by talking about these subjects, because the potential for a conflict here, you have the recipe for a giant war. The recipe couldn't be, every single ingredient is there right now. Every single ingredient between Iran and Israel, Russia, Ukraine, NATO, Russia, China, United States, China, Taiwan. You just have all the ingredients for a kinetic conflict, the likes of which the human race has never seen before. It's going to make World War II look like a game. And I just hope and pray that it's not going to happen. But, as this article says, the potential of it happening in 2024 is it's there and it's real. I used to think this was posturing because everybody's running patrols, routine patrols and drills to the South China Sea. It's nothing new. But what's odd is that you're hearing the combination of the warmongering talk from Xi Jinping, speaking to his own military. You have the inflection point coming up with the election and what that could potentially mean for the international world as they see America kind of fighting amongst themselves during the election. You got a lot of things at play right now. You have the conflict with Ukraine and Russia, so play that out another year, and let's see. Xi Jinping's probably going to see, oh, look, America is waning in their support for Russia, Ukraine, so I think we can pull the trigger on this, and maybe the United States tries to intervene for the first 6 months, and then they simply don't have the capability. If we can drag the conflict out with Russia and Ukraine and Putin and Zelensky, perhaps the United States will be at this point where they don't know who. If they have to pick between one or the other, who are they going to pick? Are they going to defend Europe, or are they going to defend the Pacific? If you put them in that kind of a situation, I think maybe America is arrogant to try both. But look, our military numbers are lower than they've ever been. The recruiting numbers are in the garbage at the moment. You just have the economic factors. The economy of nowhere in the world is going particularly well, but in the United States, our debt is over trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. It's not getting any better. It's only getting worse. And if you were to intervene and create some sort of breakaway with China economically, that could be the straw that breaks the camel's back as far as the economy goes. So my point by all this, sorry if I'm rambling, but my point by all this is there's just so much at play here, and I think that China, they've been playing the long game. They've been playing a wise game of slowly building up their military and making alliances with Russia and the like, And they have not gone for a direct conflict yet. I was a little surprised about that when they didn't do it in the previous election, but I think they've just been counting their chickens and just biding their time. They saw the Russia-Ukraine war happen. They probably want to see how that plays out, how the international community supports it and reacts to it, and at what level of involvement does America get. We see that America is hesitant to get it directly involved for good reason. In Europe, will they have the same rationale in the Taiwan Strait? I don't know, because we've heard from Biden that we would get directly involved with our own military. He has said that, and several of his administration have said that as well. Is that a bluff? Perhaps. Perhaps it is, because he spoke very differently about the Russia-Ukraine war and said that, American troops will never be on European soil for this conflict. He spoke rather differently about it in the Taiwan Strait. Let's read just a couple points that have been popping up in the news all over here on Twitter. This comes from the Spectator Index. It says, just in, the United States, Japan, and Australia will conduct naval drills in the South China Sea next week. This is an ongoing situation, but you're seeing the teams at play. You saw, as we briefly covered last week, Russia and China teamed up and were putting their warships through Alaskan waters, I think a week or two ago. I think it was the biggest convoy of warships that we've seen them collaborate with together, at least encroaching upon Alaskan territory. Breaking, this also comes from the Spectator Index, says breaking news, China starts military drills around Taiwan, calls it a stern warning. Eddie Mother Effin Spaghetti, great Twitter name, says, isn't that what Russia said before they invaded Ukraine? Yep, it happened a year before, if you guys remember correctly, and I was surprised when the conflict didn't happen initially. 1 year later, it did. And that's why I talked about in the episode yesterday, the timing of these things is what throws people off, because it doesn't happen in like movie-like timing. It doesn't happen in the way that people might think, like one Pearl Harbor type event. It doesn't always unfold like that. Sometimes it's this slow tit-for-tat situation that brews, and it just kind of waits for one or two things to kind of spark the powder keg, so to speak, and then before you know it, it's off to the races. And with World War III, I think it's going to be just like that. I think that I see multiple flashpoints that are possible. There's a lot of them, like maybe 6 or 7 flashpoints that could potentially trigger this, and to see America try to spread itself so thin just makes me wonder what these military leaders have up their sleeves. Do they know something we don't know about the capabilities of our support if we actually do go on a war footing? Because right now they're struggling to support Ukraine in the way that they want. So, you compound that with the fact of China and Taiwan, China being so close to Taiwan and having such a superior military. I just don't see this as a good situation, guys. I see a bad situation brewing. I called this before the Russia-Ukraine war, and it's not because I'm some military expert. I always say I'm no authority on this. It's simply down to the fact that you can kind of read the writing on the walls somewhat in these situations and see that, it's kind of how history goes, right? And when you hear something's brewing, the time frame isn't always what you think it might be, but it does usually kind of broil over into a conflict of some sorts, and we are treading into dangerous, uncharted waters with the combination of China and Taiwan and Russia and Ukraine simultaneously happening. You're going to spread the United States thin. I think China is ready to break away economically. I don't think they're prepared for it as far as like they would be okay, but I think that they're making drastic plans, and when that umbilical cord gets separated between us two nations, us two great superpowers, that is when it's going to get very dicey, because a lot of people have argued that's potentially the only reason why we haven't already gone to war with China, is that there has not been the capability to support ourselves with our own economy. We are dependent upon each other. That can be looked at as a good thing. The only downside with that is when it does fall, it's going to fall hard. And, what do they say? Almost all of our medication is made in China. So many of our products are made in China. We essentially are not a manufacturing country anymore. We export everything. We import everything that we buy. So China knows that, but then again, China is equally dependent upon us. We hear that China is also having their own population crisis, where they're not, their population is just not replenishing, I guess would be the word. They're not replenishing, and they have just as dire stakes as we do in this, and the potential for it to go, bad for them is just as strong as it is for us. Where I get scared is that America is just a little overly ambitious, a little living in the 90s, thinking we're in Desert Storm and we can just kind of pummel our enemies and our adversaries, and I just don't think that's the case. I think you're looking at a waning America. Could it yin and yang back and forth? Potentially, but I think right now you have to admit America is waning as a superpower, and China is not as expansionist as has maybe we've been led to believe. They haven't been starting any wars. Like the United States has been getting involved with every proxy war we possibly can all over the place. China is not to the same degree, to my knowledge. I'm not an expert. I always tell you guys I'm not an authority. I can kind of just speculate and talk back and forth about, what I think is going to happen at the end of the day. I'm not an authority. I'm just so... I read a lot of World War II stuff. I have several books that are like kind of firsthand World War II diaries of what it was like to go through the conflict on an individual basis. And all I can think is I see the writing on the wall. I see this just like World War II, World War I. I see the same ingredients, the same recipe, just way worse weapons. The economies are way more fragile. We're not ready for a conflict, so we got to stop. In my opinion, I understand that it's morally questionable to not intervene. I really do. I support Taiwan's independence from China. I support it. I don't think anybody should be subjugated, but I just think that we're talking about two bad situations. Which one is the worst one? You intervene and cause World War III and kill hundreds of millions of people. Maybe nuclear war starts. And it ruins the global economies. The stocks tank, and before you know it, we're all in breadlines. Or we don't get involved. We end up waning our support in Europe and pull back our support due to necessity. We don't get involved in the Taiwan Strait, and China takes Taiwan, and things get bad from there as well. Which situation is worse? I don't know. I'm open to hearing an argument for both, but I just see a bad writing on the wall, guys, and I know that they were hopeful and optimistic, saying maybe this won't happen to 2030, 2027. You hear different dates. I think the election year is going to be a dicey one, folks. I think it's going to be dicey. I hope I'm wrong about that. But as we talked about in yesterday's episode, there does seem to be a global awareness, a global consciousness that something's brewing. Is it going to be war? Is it going to be UFO disclosure? Is it going to be economic collapse? Is it going to be another pandemic? God, time will tell, folks. Time will tell. Let's just pray this conflict doesn't happen. I don't know, man. I don't know. I think the timing is odd. I think that when you add in the domestic front of the political landscape here in America, it really does dictate a lot of what goes on in the rest of the world. It is important to the other nations who becomes president, and it's a particularly tension-filled time when the election's going on, especially you guys know what's going to happen in 2024. It's going to be wild. Whatever does happen, I don't care to keep up with politics all that much. I really don't. But I do care in the realm of seeing how it could affect the world geopolitically, and could it inspire Xi Jinping to go and make that kinetic move on Taiwan, just like whatever caused Putin to decide to go kinetic. Those same factors could be at play with China and Taiwan, and clearly China can benefit by looking at what's going on with Russia. They can learn, they can study what's going well, what's going bad, and kind of adjust their position from there. I think largely it's been a wait and see strategy from them, but I think that they're going to see that they got to strike while the iron's hot. I think America is probably the weakest it's ever been, or at least been in a long time. And if you were going to strike, it would probably make sense to do it during the election year. So give me your thoughts on that, guys. I am open to other possibilities. That's just off the top of my dome what I think is possible. If you guys appreciate this type of content and you want to see daily episodes covering this geopolitical front, UFC news, and also the UFO phenomenon and what's going on with that, do me a favor and just click subscribe. It means a lot here on the YouTube channel. If you're listening on any of the podcast platforms, just click follow. It takes 1 second, and leave me a 5-star review. And lastly, if you guys would like to be a part of the conversation and talk with me and people from all over the place, we got a small but growing group on Discord at Mixed Martian Arts. You can find the link in the description to this video, and we just share news, share experiences, our opinions, ask questions, and just kind of create like a little group, just kind of with people with the same interest, really, just people who like talking about this. I'm fascinated by these subjects, and to me it never gets old, and there's just so much developing in all three of these areas that I love talking to other people about it and hearing their opinions, and we're going to be evolving it over time and doing some fun stuff as a group. So I appreciate you guys so much for tuning in. We'll be back with another episode, I think doing a recap of tonight's UFC pay-per-view. So hope you all check it out. Have a good night. See ya.